But first, let's get to it. Where are we in the state of the race right now, and what needs to happen next? We got here for a couple of reasons. Every candidate on that stage was attacking Bernie Sanders, the movement, the establishment, including cable television, which function as super PACs against the Sanders campaign and the working class of this country, aggressively coalesced. President Obama, completing his arc of portrayal of young people in this country, aggressively worked to consolidate the right-wing corporate sector of the Democratic Party to block Bernie Sanders. And by extension, let's be really explicit, you having health care, you having student loan relief, you having housing, you having basic decency. Elizabeth Warren, we'll talk about more later, but regardless of whatever story you want to tell about her, has functionally and in terms of reality worked as a wrecker campaign. That's reality. That's how it's worked. If Bernie Sanders was sitting at around 9-10% and primarily complaining about Warren being negative while she was the lead candidate, no one would have any trouble recognizing what the dynamic was. The shoe's on the other foot. There's a lot of obscuring, a lot of delusion, and a lot of nonsense, but it is what it is. We should have owned the frontrunner status when we had it, and it required a juxtaposition, a challenging synthesis. The reality is that a lot of Democratic voters, including the voters that are showing up, because the new coalition is not showing up. That's reality. That part of the Sanders plan is failing. So a lot of upper middle class suburban voters are showing up, and a lot of other members of the Democratic Party across the spectrum, geographically and in terms of racial background, who have more conservative politics. And this shouldn't have been a surprise to any of us. It is a different dynamic. When Donald Trump took on the Republican Party in 2016, he took a party that is run in terms of money and establishment at the end of the day by corporations and oligarchs, and has a base that has serious material concerns like anyone else, and also is rooted in xenophobia and white identity politics to a very large extent. And he had a very easy job. We hate the Republican elites. We hate the Democratic elites. We hate the media. And we also are going to be very persuaded by a deeply xenophobic program. He gave it to them. Bernie had a tougher thread to needle, has a tougher thread to needle. He needs to fundamentally say, actually, for the parts of the Democratic Party that represent actual human working class people who have real serious, urgent material concerns, he represents them. Doesn't mean that every single person from a working class or poor background is going to vote for him, but a lot of them are, and that's what his agenda represents. That's what his agenda is about. And his agenda is also predicated on the idea that the only way of dealing with Trump and Trump-like things is to get America out of this state of absolute barbarism and cruelty that it has been in for decades under Republicans and Democrats. He needs to synthesize that with actually telling the suburban types, I know you crave moderation. I know you crave normalcy. And the only way you're going to get anything approximating that is actually through some real reform. That's the needle that he needs to thread. And he also needs to say, and in no uncertain terms, and we'll get to it in a moment, Joe Biden is not going to run against Donald Trump. Let's be real. That's not a real race. The Democratic Party has coalesced with more efficacy, more strategy, more coherence, and more energy to stop you having health care than anything they've done in decades. Be very clear about that. And the Bernie campaign from the beginning did an incredible job on organizing, put forward some fantastic policies, but lost some of the simplicity and clarity they overcorrected from 2016. And there was an unwillingness, and maybe this goes to the candidate himself, to clearly differentiate with Warren in the beginning and frankly, aggressively go to an attack against Biden for several months. I will note, for folks, though, who are dead-enders defending Warren, Sanders was actually choreographing a Social Security attack on Biden before the first primaries, right when Warren did her first smear campaign. So let's be real about that momentum as well. But the Sanders campaign has needed to do a hell of a lot more, both in terms of attacking and being clear about its opponents, whether they're Warren or Biden or anybody else, and actually playing the game of, at least trying to get Jim Clyburn's endorsement, even though we know it's not coming. But that's the game. Maybe he could have been convinced to not endorse, and that might have helped in South Carolina. Now, here is the good. We took California. That was the main prize. There was overwhelming dominance with Hispanic people and working class people. That's the future. That's the core in many, many respects. Does it need to continue to grow out? Does it need to include older African-American voters, some suburban voters, and does it need to reclaim some rural voters? 100%. But there is some key indicators here along incredibly important groups of people in this country who are growing and having their actual concerns spoken to in an unprecedented way. They turned out for Sanders, and he won the most important state, California. The coalition we're building with youth, working class people is massive. And that movement has implications for the future. A whole lot of them have not had their say yet of this vital coalition, including in crucial Midwest states, where it will be key for not only Bernie Sanders to stop the Democratic machine, but for him to defeat Donald Trump. There is an establishment, and they represent 1% class interests, and we have to beat them. People talk about corruption or cheating when it comes to Sanders, and there's instances of that. But what is most important is the absolute refusal of the Democratic establishment and its mouthpieces that trickle out of it to remotely entertain the idea of the Sanders candidacy and, by extension, any working class or poor people's agenda. Establishment Democrats love to talk about the bright future when the youth take over. But when America becomes majority minority, meanwhile, they squash and destroy and undermine those voices every chance they get. We've got a lot of fighting left to do. We need to be strategic and smart. We always need to look for ways to grow. We need to be firm in what we cannot accept. This movement has ignited a fire in so many because it's different, because it cut through the corporate bullshit, woke speak, and of tinkering with economic systems, instead fundamentally challenging them. There's a huge difference between our movement and the Democratic Party. Our ideas need to win. That means a lot of people need to get way more serious. This isn't a club. It's not a cultural movement. It's not a cult. It's a real political movement that's based on empowering the powerless, not out of sympathy, but out of solidarity. Liberals are trotting out the same old lines about unity they've put forward for years. In 1996, Adolph Reed wrote about liberals the following that I'll conclude this commentary with. The propensity for aestheticizing other people's oppression and calling that activism, their reflex to wring their hands and look constipated in the face of conflict, and most of all, their spinelessness and independability in crisis. It's just as true now, and we cannot allow this empty Democratic, it is just as true now, and we cannot allow an empty Democratic politics to continue because it is fundamentally ill-equipped and opposed to us in the fight ahead. Entertain for a moment as we continue playing this ridiculous game with Elizabeth Warren. Her supporters, her surrogates, folks that are part of it, who have endorsed Bernie, that's great. We welcome you. It's beautiful. I'll do the usual disclaimer that some people apparently need to hear, although it should be obvious. Could you imagine if Gandhi, after a meeting of the Indian National Congress, someone sent him a telegram about the next state of action against the British Empire, and he wrote a telegram back that instead of the Salt March, he was just like, after not having my lived experience honored at the last meeting, that's Mandela. My lived experience was not, yeah, it works too. Steve Biko was very rude, so P.T. Bartha has a point. You know, yes, the apartheid security services murdering us is bad, but also me not being respected all the time in exactly the way I want, or getting every single thing I want in ANC internal deliberations, also bad. So, we'll see. Apartheid government, ANC. I have to check in with my own lived experience right now. Or Gandhi, I think. Gandhi telegrams back like, hey, thanks for reaching out. Super appreciated. I'm totally not in a space mentally or spiritually or emotionally where I can take on this question right now. The awe-inspiring narcissism and entitlement should be evident. If it's not, it's not. But I can't sugarcoat this stuff because this actually, immediately has huge implications for the planet, but it also speaks to some folks want us to just jettison liberalism. That's not a realistic look at the political environment. You know, that's not reality. Just as woke speak has nothing to do with most people across the board, we're not going to go out and get some of these anxious suburban voters by even talking about very important things like defending Castro or something. Okay, that's not what we're going to do. You watch TMBS, you read, you have a long-term education project, of course. But there are folks in positions of some power in very small circles who have some information brokering power, and they are in a historical, critical moment, starting with Elizabeth Warren herself, using like self-care language after a breakup or something. And not only is it like embarrassing and disgusting, it speaks to a broader attitude, which is always going to be fundamentally antithetical to class politics. Period. And I hate like fetishizing and romanticizing of anybody. And, like people of all backgrounds can be great individuals. People of all backgrounds can be assholes. And most people of all backgrounds are, of course, complicated, difficult creatures, as all humans are, right? But like, so it's not to say you can meet somebody who's super privileged and well off, who's nicer to deal with than somebody who's poor. But there is going to be, almost no poor person, nobody working. They can't say, oh, I don't know if it's more like I'm physically violently ill and I have to go drive Uber because my family will get evicted. It's not like I'm going to check in with myself about that. And for people who've insisted endlessly, and again, it doesn't matter. Yes, Elizabeth Warren's a careerist and she's pissed off that she didn't get what she wanted. That's 99.999% of politicians. That's Joe Biden. That's Paul Ryan. That's what these people are. They're careerists and they're trying to get to the highest point of the meritocracy. Bernie Sanders is a different type of person. There's no doubt about that. There's a reason he fought in the margins for 40 years. Now, on the other hand, he's a stubborn old goat who won't fucking, he keeps calling Joe Biden his friend, says Joe Biden can win. I think that's a fucking disaster. So I'm not saying that there aren't criticisms of Bernie Sanders, but he is the only one in this bracket of field who's cares about this stuff on a kind of fun, elemental level. Everything else is transactional for all these folks, including Warren. And what's disturbing is that folks don't see that. People, I'll be even more provocative. A lot of my irritation is not really with her, it's with you. If you fall into that bracket, it's great. She wants to be president. Cool. A lot of ambitious, smart people want to be president. Great. But you can't fall for, you got to look at the pattern of what's happened here. And, it's a real tactical question that I'm not sure of, right? In the last couple of days, were you in a Hail Mary pass going to suck up to Warren and even offer her VP, which would be a terrible idea in a general election because, again, as never gets acknowledged in these conversations, she doesn't have that many votes. Or do you actually start to consistently and clearly say, and not just leave it to, people on Twitter, this person doesn't share our political project and has run a very unhelpful campaign if your goal is left-wing politics of any sort, not to settle accounts or attack or all, but just literally, again, it's another political question. How about you dilute somebody's brand who's harming you? This is politics. This isn't like some movie where, and then all of a sudden the call comes through and there's Elizabeth. It's transactional. It's politics. And and everybody's got their, some people really look at on a much, 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 much grander scale. That was Obama. That was very hard for people to recognize. Yes, there's a million other factors with Obama. There's the racism. There's the historical nature of his candidacy. There's the fact that he's unparalleled in personal charisma. There's the fact that he and his family were attacked relentlessly by the worst forces in our society on a minute-by-minute basis. And then there was just the other fact that the guy is a fucking conduit of Wall Street in Silicon Valley. That's it. There's nothing to figure out there. Those are his politics. And I think that's the tendency that concerns me most, is the inability to just, do some balls and strikes. You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.